Mexico City, 1950. The city never truly sleeps. Even after midnight, the streets hum with life, the rumble of trolleys, the cries of vendors, the low murmur of people who never quite made it home. Steam curls from food carts lined along the sidewalks, thick and fragrant. In the markets, women in aprons stir pots of masa, shaping dough with calloused hands, selling tamales for a few coins to feed their families. Among them was one woman whose name would outlive them all. Teresa Romero. To most, she was unremarkable. A quiet widow with tired eyes and a gentle voice. She sold tamales near the Portales market, just a small corner stall made of wood and tin, her cart patched with rust and faith. She worked alone, morning to night, her hair tied in a loose knot, her apron faded from years of use. Every day she moved through the same rhythm: grind, mix, fold, steam, the daily heartbeat of survival. Those who passed her stall swore her tamales tasted different. Softer, richer, as if she used spices no one else could afford. Children would run to her before school, the elderly would stop by on their way home. They said she had a gift, that her food was touched with something rare. But even then, no one could quite describe what made her cooking so unforgettable. Some said it was the tenderness. Others said it was the smell that drifted from her kitchen at night, strange, sweet, heavy. She lived in a cramped room behind her stall. Bare walls. One small bed. One stove. A photo of her late husband, Santiago, hung crooked on the wall. People said they used to fight. That he drank too much. That his temper broke through the thin walls of their home, loud enough for everyone to hear. Still, in those days, no one interfered. Domestic fights were not the kind of thing neighbors got involved in. Poverty made everyone look away. For weeks, the neighborhood heard shouts coming from that small kitchen. Then the shouting stopped. Only the smell remained. It came at night first. Faint, unusual, but unmistakable. Dogs began howling near her door. The butcher down the street said it reminded him of burning fat, something that didn't belong. When asked about it, Teresa would only smile and say she was trying a new recipe. People believed her. They always did. Day after day, she stood behind her cart, her hands never still. When customers asked where Santiago was, she said he'd gone to visit family, or that he'd taken work in another district. No one questioned it. Men disappeared all the time, to find work, to escape debts, to vanish from the lives they'd ruined. Teresa went on cooking, humming under her breath as she worked, her eyes low, her smile steady. But one afternoon, the air grew thick with the smell. It seeped through walls, clung to clothing, filled the alleyways. A neighbor named Estella finally walked to the police station and said something was wrong. She told them Teresa's husband hadn't been seen in over a week. She told them the smell from the house was unbearable. She said, "Please, just check on her." When the police arrived, they found Teresa standing in her doorway, pale, her apron wet, her hands trembling. She said she had been boiling meat for hours, that it was for her customers the next morning. The officers looked at one another and stepped inside. The house was small, barely room to move. Steam poured from the kitchen. The smell hit them all at once, thick, metallic, sour. A pot sat on the stove, still bubbling. On the table, banana leaves were laid out, already filled and folded, ready to be wrapped. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the officers lifted the lid. What he saw made his knees buckle. In the pot, mixed with broth and spices, was something that could never belong in a kitchen. Flesh. Pieces too large to mistake for any animal. Bones in the sink. Blood on the floor, streaked into the cracks of the tiles. One of the men stumbled outside to catch his breath. The other whispered the husband's name. In the corner of the room, a bundle covered by a sheet. When they pulled it back, there was no doubt left. Santiago Romero would never leave Portales again. Teresa said nothing. She stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor, her lips pressed together as if praying silently. The officers asked her why. She didn't answer. They asked again. Finally, she whispered, "He would not stop hurting me." By sunrise, word had spread across the market. Vendors gathered outside her door, some crying, some cursing her name. Newspapers rushed to print the story before the facts were even known. The woman who made the city's favorite tamales had been taken away in handcuffs. Some said she had lost her mind. Others said she had planned it all along. But as the smoke from her stove drifted into the morning sky, one question began to take shape, passing from mouth to mouth across Mexico City. Were the tamales they had eaten truly made from what they thought they were? No one could answer. No one would ever forget. The morning after the discovery, the police report made its way through every department in the city. Officers who had never set foot in Portales arrived to see the house for themselves. The small kitchen had been sealed off, but even through the doorway the smell lingered. The walls were stained, the pots still warm from the night before. An officer in a pressed uniform stood with a handkerchief over his mouth, reading from his notes, trying to describe what they had found. The words came out flat, emotionless, but his hand shook as he turned each page. Pieces of bone, fragments of flesh, a half-filled pot of broth. The body had been cut apart carefully, not with rage, but with method. The report mentioned knives, a wooden mallet, a cloth soaked with blood. It described the tamale wrappers that were already prepared and stacked neatly by the stove. What the paper did not say was how ordinary it all looked. A kitchen like any other, except for the silence that filled it. By noon, the press had arrived. Reporters from the city's biggest papers pushed past the crowd, snapping photographs, shouting questions that no one could answer. The next day's headlines would carry the same words in bold letters: human flesh in tamales. The question mark would vanish in later editions. In the markets, panic spread faster than the news itself. People stopped buying food from street vendors. Tamale stands stood empty, their pots untouched. Customers who once lined up for breakfast now crossed the street to avoid them. Some threw their food away in disgust, some swore they could still taste it, that they would never eat tamales again. Neighbors who had known Teresa for years stood outside her stall, whispering, staring at the rusted cart she had pushed every morning. Mothers covered their children's eyes as they passed. The smell of fear clung to the air just as stubbornly as the scent from her kitchen had. Vendors accused one another of knowing, of helping, of hiding something. In Portales, it took only one rumor to start a riot. Women shouted from their stalls, men threw stones at the locked door of Teresa's house. The police had to block the street to keep people from breaking in. A woman fainted when she heard that she might have eaten there the week before. Another broke down crying, clutching a bag of tamales she'd bought that morning and could no longer bear to open. The newspapers could not print fast enough. Each edition made the story larger, more grotesque. The truth mattered less with every headline. They called her La Tamalera Asesina, the murderous tamale maker. Some papers said she had served the meat to hundreds. Others claimed she had sold out completely the day after the killing. By the end of the week, the name Teresa Romero was no longer spoken in the market. She was simply the woman. Her photograph appeared everywhere. Grainy, dark, taken as she was led into the police car. Her face was calm, her eyes lowered, her hair disheveled. People studied that picture as if it could answer the question none of them dared to ask out loud: how could someone so ordinary do something so unthinkable? Across the city, the tamale pots stayed cold. Vendors watched their earnings vanish. Children whispered the story on their way to school. Families locked their doors at night, listening to the radio for updates. The newsman spoke her name like a curse, a warning, a story too terrible to be true, but too strange not to believe. And in the middle of all that noise, in a dim cell beneath the city jail, Teresa Romero sat alone, silent as ever, waiting for someone to ask her what had really happened in that small kitchen on the night the city lost its appetite. In the interrogation room, the light above her flickered. Teresa sat with her hands folded on the table, her fingers still rough from years of work. Across from her, two officers took turns asking questions, their voices calm at first, then sharper, their patience thinning with each unanswered word. She looked at neither of them. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost too quiet to hear. She said she had been tired for a long time. Tired of shouting, tired of bruises, tired of hiding. When they asked her why she had killed him, she said only, "He beat me every night. I just wanted peace." They wrote down every word. They asked again how she had done it. She told them it had happened after another fight, when he had stumbled and drunk and reached for the knife. She said she didn't remember the moment clearly, only the silence that followed. She said the silence had felt like mercy. The men in the room looked at one another, unsure whether to believe her. She spoke of the days that came after. The body lying there, the smell she could not bear, the fear that someone would come knocking. She said she had not meant to hide it, only to make it disappear. When they pressed her to explain what that meant, she said nothing more. One officer slammed his notebook shut and left the room. The other sat back, watching her, trying to see guilt in her face, but there was only exhaustion. They called in a psychiatrist, who spoke to her for hours. He said she seemed lost between guilt and relief, that she wept when she mentioned her mother, but not when she described the killing. He said she talked about hunger often, about how food had been the only thing she could control. When he asked her about the tamales, she said she had made them out of habit. It was what she did every day. Her past came out slowly, piece by piece, through court records and interviews. She had grown up in the countryside, one of 7 children. Her father died when she was 12, and she moved to the city to work as a housemaid. By 16, she was married to a man twice her age. Poverty followed her wherever she went. The years that came after were filled with beatings, lost pregnancies, and the dull rhythm of survival. There were no photographs of her youth, no letters, nothing that showed who she had been before she became the woman everyone feared. Experts later tried to explain what happened through the lens of the time. In post-war Mexico, thousands of women lived in the shadows of men they could not escape. Work was scarce, laws were cruel, and poverty made victims of them all. Teresa's story, they said, was not unique, it was only louder because of how it ended. Some called it desperation. Others called it madness. When the confession came, it was late in the night, after hours of silence. The officer on duty said she lifted her head and began to speak without being asked. She said she had killed him because she saw no other way to survive. She said she had cut him apart because she was afraid of what would happen if someone found out. But she denied ever feeding anyone the flesh. She swore the tamales were made only of pork, that the rumors were the invention of men who needed a monster to sell their papers. Her voice did not shake as she spoke. She said she knew she would die for what she had done, and that she accepted it. What she could not accept was being remembered as the woman who had fed people their own kind. She said, "They will not see me as a wife or a worker or a woman. They will only see what they want to fear." By the time she finished, the officer could not tell if he was listening to a murderer or a woman crushed by a lifetime of hunger and pain. He wrote down her final words, closed the file, and walked out of the room. And so her story divided the city. Some said she was a killer without remorse. Others said she was a victim who broke under the weight of her own misery. No one could agree on what to believe. But one truth remained, whether she had fed a city its own nightmare, or whether the city had fed on her tragedy, Teresa Romero had already become more legend than woman. The courtroom was crowded long before the trial began. Reporters lined the walls, their pens scratching across notepads, waiting for any word that might make the next morning's headline. The air was stifling, filled with whispers and the rustle of paper. Teresa sat at the defendant's table, her hair neatly tied, her face expressionless. The judge spoke in a calm, detached tone, reading the charges as if they were an ordinary theft or dispute. But outside the courthouse, it was anything but ordinary. Crowds gathered at the gates, shouting her name, some demanding justice, others simply curious to see the woman whose tamales had turned into a nation's nightmare. When the evidence was presented, it was clear that the crime was brutal, but the details that had shaken the city could not be proven. There were bones, there was blood, there was death. But there was no proof that anyone had eaten what she had cooked. The prosecution pushed the story that the newspapers had already made famous, but the defense argued that there was no trace of human flesh beyond her kitchen. The witnesses contradicted one another, repeating rumors they'd heard in the market rather than facts they'd seen. The trial became a spectacle, less about guilt and more about fear. Teresa spoke only once. She stood, her hands trembling slightly, and said she was guilty of killing her husband, but nothing more. She said she had made tamales her whole life, and that no one could tell where truth ended and lies began anymore. The judge listened without expression. When the verdict came, the court found her guilty of murder and improper disposal of a body. There was no mention of cannibalism, no mention of tamales. Yet when the crowd outside heard the verdict, they jeered as though justice had not been done. As months passed, the case drifted from the courtroom to the streets. The story grew louder with each retelling. Radio shows began to dramatize the events, their narrators whispering her name late at night, describing in lurid detail what had never been proven. Tabloids printed illustrations of her stirring a pot, the faces of her neighbors drawn as horrified onlookers. In the city markets, people began to tell the story differently each time. Some said she sold hundreds of tamales made from her husband's flesh. Others said she had killed more than one man. None of it could be traced back to her words, yet the story spread until it belonged to everyone. Historians later said this was where facts surrendered to folklore. It was no longer about Teresa Romero, the woman who lived and worked in Portales, but about what she came to represent. She became a warning whispered to children, a ghost haunting the stalls where food was sold. The people who had once bought from her began to say they had always suspected something strange. The city needed a story to carry its fears, and hers was the one it chose. As the years turned into decades, her name began to change. Newspapers that revisited the story called her La Tamalera de la Lagunilla, shifting her from Portales to the city's largest market, where the legend would find its home. Her photograph disappeared from the archives, replaced by drawings that made her look older, harder, less human. Each generation retold her tale in a new voice. For some, she was the devil in disguise, for others, she was the woman who finally fought back. By the 1980s, children whispered her story to one another in the dark, daring each other to visit the market at night. They said that if you bought tamales from a woman who would not meet your eyes, you might taste something you were never meant to eat. Parents used her name to frighten their sons into obedience. Street vendors told the tale to amuse tourists, laughing as they spoke it, though they always lowered their voices at the end. And so the woman who once stood silent in a courtroom became a myth passed from mouth to mouth, a story too strange to die. Teresa Romero vanished into history, her truth buried beneath the words of others. What remained was a legend, a whisper in the night markets of Mexico City, a name spoken softly by those who still wondered whether the taste they remembered had ever really been her secret after all. Maybe she never sold human tamales. But maybe she did. The truth has a way of slipping through the cracks of memory, reshaped by the mouths that tell it. Decades have passed, yet her name still drifts through the air of Mexico's night markets, a name carried on the steam of fresh masa, on the soft hum of street songs, on the quiet fear that something ordinary could hide something terrible. History recorded her as a murderer, legend recast her as a monster, and somewhere in between those two stories, a real woman once stood, poor, beaten, desperate, and forgotten. What began as a crime became a warning, and then a whisper. Every generation retells her tale differently. Some speak of revenge, others of madness, others still of survival. But in every version, one thing remains unchanged, the taste of her secret, whatever it truly was. Maybe it was grief that seasoned her tamales. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was only hunger, the kind that no food can satisfy. When you walk through a market at night, the smoke still hangs heavy in the air. Vendors call out their prices, the rhythm of their voices blending with the hiss of boiling pots. And somewhere in that chorus, if you listen closely, you might hear her story again. Not from a book, not from a file, but from someone's grandmother, or a vendor who swears his uncle once tasted her cooking. The words change, but the warning doesn't: never ask too much about what gives a meal its flavor. The case was never proven. No human meat was ever officially confirmed. But the story survived, whispered from stall to stall, told to children with a shiver, shared by those who don't even know her name. Teresa Romero became more than a woman. She became a shadow stitched into Mexico's folklore, her legend simmering between truth and fear. So as this story closes, ask yourself, what makes a legend live? The crime, or the people who keep telling it? Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. Maybe the story is the truth now. Because every time someone tells it, somewhere, another pot begins to boil. If you found this story haunting, share it. Keep it alive. Like, comment, and subscribe, because every tale like this carries a piece of history, and the more we tell them, the closer we come to understanding how far a story can travel once it leaves the truth behind.